Welcome back. Let's launch straight into this section of work on geometric or exponential growth. If we were to define what we mean by geometric or exponential growth, we're going to see that it's a pattern of growth. And the situation is that our population is living in a wonderful area where there are no limiting factors. Right, so this is kind of the ideal situation. In our last lesson, we spoke about limiting factors. So in this lesson, we've got to think, imagine an environment where there are no limiting factors. Food as much as we want, water as much as we want, as much space as we need. So what we're looking at is not really an entirely realistic situation, but let's look at it anyway. In this situation where we have no limiting factors, what would such a growth curve look like? And I want you to think about if you can make some kind of prediction, because that's what science and learning in science is all about, is making a prediction or a hypothesis and then testing it and seeing, was your hypothesis correct? Was your prediction correct? Or do you have to go back to the drawing board and start all over? So you scribble quickly onto your piece of paper that you've got a graph with the number of our organisms on the y-axis and time as our independent variable on the x-axis. So think about it. What is going to happen to the number of organisms over time if there are no limiting factors? Draw me in this space a picture of what you see happening to your line graph if we have no limiting factors. All right? 2 seconds. You've drawn your axes and you've drawn your picture. Now, to help us out, we're going to look at an actual example. You've got your prediction there. You've drawn it. Now let's look at a particular example and let's see if your prediction matches the science. So, bacteria reproduce by binary fission, and they do it very fast. Once an hour in this case. So let's imagine that we had a flask and we put 1,000 bacterial cells into this very large flask, and we're going to insert nutrients, and we're not going to limit the amount of nutrients. All the time there's going to be feeding in of adequate nutrients, adequate oxygen, and we're going to keep our flask at the ideal temperature for these bacteria. So what we've done is we've said no limiting factors, as much space as the bacteria need. We've also said, right, as much food as they need. We have created bacterial paradise, and off the bacteria go with their asexual reproduction. And we find that after 1 hour, there'd be 2,000. So there we go. We started with 1,000. We've doubled it after 1 hour. It would be 4,000 after the second hour, 8,000 after the third hour. And you can see what's happening here. These bacteria are in bacterial party mode. They are enjoying this unlimited food, space, oxygen. And if you did the maths, you would see, and you would obviously recognize without maths even, that this population is accelerating at a greater and greater rate. After 1 day, in other words, 24 hours, what started as a population of 1,000 bacteria will end up at around 16 billion bacteria, what does your growth curve look like? What did you predict? What would that growth curve actually look like? Well, let's see. When a population size is plotted over time, we see that we're going to get a J-shaped growth curve. Let's have a look at it. Here it is. Do you see that it's vaguely J-shaped? And we call this a geometric or exponential growth curve. Here's our number of organisms. Over time, we see that our curve starts increasing exponentially. How does this picture relate back to your prediction that you made? Were you right? Were you wrong? Let's talk about the features of this particular growth curve. We see that at the beginning of the time that we were measuring, there's something called a lag phase. Now, if you lag, it means you hang behind a little bit. So if you're going on a long hike up a mountain and you're lagging behind, that means that you're at the back of the group of people hiking up the mountain. You'll be with me, all right? We'll be the laggers. We'll be slower than the others. The population increases slowly in the beginning. So in the beginning, we see there are not many individuals. There were only 1,000 individuals reproducing. But over time, we see that this growth rate accelerates. And we enter this stage, which is called the exponential growth phase. This means that as time passes, the number of individuals increases and the population begins to grow quicker and quicker. And so that means that our curve becomes steeper and steeper. And that's where we get the description or the name for this kind of growth curve, an exponential growth curve. Because we start with 1,000. After an hour, we've got 2,000. After another hour, we've got 4,000. So we're starting slowly, but eventually we're going to see that this skyrockets in terms of how many bacteria are being added to our population. Now, I mentioned something earlier and I asked you, do you think it's realistic? Are our resources always unlimited in a real world? Now, in our little flask, we're keeping the temperature correct. We're making sure there's sufficient space for all these bacteria. But there is something that's going to also be building up inside that flask. We're putting food in all the time. We're keeping the nutrients flowing in. But as you know, anything in life, nutrients in, waste products out. So at the same time that we are providing all the resources, we need to understand that as this population is growing, so are the waste products in the flask growing. And when you get sick from a bacterial infection, it's usually because of the toxins or waste products that the bacterium that is infecting you is producing in your body. So these toxins and wastes that the bacteria themselves are producing, they can start to affect this population in a negative way. So let's see now what happens to our growth curve. We start to see that at a certain point, there we go, the population growth stops. It's not increasing, it's leveling out. And this is due to something called environmental resistance. So it could be overcrowding, it could be an increase in the concentration of waste products. If we stopped adding nutrients to the flask, lack of food could be a limiting factor. Remember that food is a density dependent limiting factor, so certainly maybe we've underestimated how much nutrients 6 billion bacteria are going to need, so maybe food becomes a limiting factor. And we see that our population stabilizes due to this thing called, or this concept called, environmental resistance. So let's unpack environmental resistance a little. Things in the environment or the ecosystem that are going to limit the growth of a population. There could be biotic factors such as predators, disease, competition, lack of food, but could also be abiotic factors like a fire moving or a flood coming through a particular ecosystem. And then we're going to say this is environmental resistance that is stopping that population from increasing in size. So we would see then that there's now a sudden decrease in the number of individuals as the mortality or death rate increases. But I'm asking you a question now for you to make another prediction. What would happen if we move that population of bacteria to a bigger flask and we gave it more food and we cleaned out its waste products, for example? What would then happen to this population growth curve? Well, what we would see is that our growth curve would decline, we return conditions favorable, and it goes up again, but eventually we're going to start seeing these fluctuations or these booms. That's the boom, and then bust. The population collapses. And this is typical of the kind of geometric or exponential growth rate that we see. Slow population growth in first, rapid, and then we're going to see that we will probably see that there's a doubling at regular intervals of that population size, but then there's going to be the sudden drop, and this is when resources run out or environmental resistance starts to creep in. But we know that this original J shape in the positive growth phase is very typical of an exponentially growing population. Now you've got a picture of exponential or geometric growth. And we know that we're going to see a slow start to that population growth. It's going to rapidly pick up, and it's going to be in this J shape. Now, I told you at the beginning of this section that we were talking about geometric growth as it relates to no limits. All right, nothing is placed on this population in terms of a limit. Lots of food, lots of space, ideal temperature, ideal oxygen conditions. I want you now to predict what would happen if we in fact placed limits on the population. What if we took those bacteria and instead of putting them into a large flask and making sure there was lots of food available to them, what if there were limits placed on this population? Now think of it in terms of the real world. Your throat is a wonderful environment for a particular kind of bacteria. And there are limitations because there's a lack of space for example. Possibly you're going to find that the temperature changes, because what happens when you get a bacterial infection? Your immune system knocks up your fever and it causes inflammation. So all of these factors are limits on that bacterial population. And if we take our focus away from bacterial populations and we talk about populations of impala in a particular area, there are limitations, the predators, the lack of water, the lack of space, the lack of available mates, for example. So now let's look and turn our attention to a situation where there are limits. We are not going to have this ideal lab situation. We're going to take it out there into the real world, and we're going to look at the second kind of growth curve. And that second kind of growth curve is called a logistic growth curve. So now you will have two types of growth curves that you must be able to recognize and that you should be able to compare. So if you're ready, let's move on then to logistic growth curves. When we look at logistic growth curves, we're looking at a completely different situation. In the beginning of this population's growth, we're going to see something very similar to what we saw with geometric or exponential growth. Because our population in an area starts small, there's lots of space, there are lots of nesting or shelter places, there are food and water is plentiful. The predators don't know who's come into their area. So in the beginning of the population growth, we would see that basically ideal conditions are at first going to be taking place. So we can see that we'll have a bit of a lag phase, and then our population will enter the exponential growth phase. And that is very, very familiar to you from our exploration of geometric or exponential growth. So far, everything in this new area that our small population has immigrated to is ideal. And so we see that population growth is really positive. It's accelerating. But we're now going to start showing a decrease in the growth rate. Do you see that our growth curve is not quite as steep as what it was? We've entered what we call a deceleration phase. What we're seeing now is the effect of limiting factors. Our population has grown so well in this new environment, but now maybe we're starting to run out of food. Maybe the predators know we're here. Or if we were predators in this area, maybe the prey is starting to run out a little. So what we're seeing is a slowing down of the growth rate. And we are now going to enter into a more stable equilibrium phase. So our population eventually, so it was growing very fast, it's now going to slow down, and it's going to enter into a period of slowing down of growth, and we call this kind of pattern that we can see, I'm going to show it underneath here, is more of an S shape than a J shape. We call this logistic growth. Now, we need to discuss what is happening over here at that part of the growth in order to move from the J-shaped graph into this sigmoid or S-shaped graph. So let's explore some of these ideas. What caused the slowing down of the population growth rate? And we're going to be relating back to what you've learned about limiting factors. As the density of our population increases, so limiting factors are now going to start slowing down the growth rate of the population. We're going to see maybe a lack of food, greater competition, fewer nesting sites or birthing sites. We're going to see that our population has now reached a stage of equilibrium. And this S-shaped graph is typical of logistic growth. So if you're looking at two different growth curves and you see one has a J shape and one has a more S shape, you know that the logistic growth curve is going to be your sigmoid or S-shaped graph. So let's go very quickly through the phases that we already know about. We know the lag phase is slow growth over time because there are only a few individuals reproducing. The individuals need to get used to the area. So we're seeing eventually, once they're used to the area, this exponential period of growth where there's little to stop our growth of the population. Natality, or the birth rate, is greater than the death rate. But then things start to slow down and we enter the decelerating phase. This thing called environmental resistance increases, and you can see how I've indicated it on the graph with little arrows pointing down. The environmental resistance means something is stopping this growth curve from just climbing up. And we enter now into this final phase, the equilibrium or stationary phase, where the growth of the population almost stops. But look, there are small fluctuations that maintain the size of the population around one particular point. We would say that natality is now equal to mortality. We'll see a few changes or fluctuations, but basically what we're seeing with logistic growth is that the population is now being limited by the environment, by the population itself. If you can't find a mate, you can't increase the size of the population. So environmental resistance and limiting factors are now preventing the population from overshooting the mark and overpopulation taking place. We're now going to take a short break, and when you come back after the break, we're going to explore a whole lot of questions that help you understand how this kind of growth curve can be plotted. And you need your pen and paper for this, so make sure you've got it with you.